All right, today we are cracking open one of history's greatest cold cases, the sudden, violent collapse of the entire Bronze Age world, and the mysterious group that got blamed for it all, the Sea Peoples. So let's jump right in and start examining the evidence. Our story really kicks off right here, with this absolutely incredible scene carved into the walls of an Egyptian temple. I mean, just look at it. It shows this chaotic naval battle. For over a century, this single image has basically been Exhibit A, shaping our whole view of a mysterious enemy who just seemed to appear from the sea and set the world on fire. But before we can even begin to identify the culprits, we need to understand the sheer scale of the crime scene. And trust me, it was massive. This wasn't just one city falling or a single kingdom getting knocked over. We are talking about a widespread systemic collapse. Powerful, literate, city-building civilizations that have thrived for centuries, like the mighty Hittite Empire and the legendary Mycenaean Greeks of Trojan War fame, they just blinked out of existence. Trade routes shattered, cities were burned to the ground, and in a lot of places, the skill of writing itself was just lost. And don't just take my word for it. This isn't some modern exaggeration. This is a direct quote from the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III. He's listing off this whole series of powerful kingdoms that were, in his own words, cut off. You can feel the terror in this message, right? To them, it must have felt like the end of the world, like an unstoppable wave of destruction was just rolling over them. So who did Ramesses and the Egyptians blame for this apocalypse? Well, let's meet the prime suspects. Okay, the first crucial thing to get your head around is that the name Sea Peoples is a modern invention. It was actually coined by scholars back in the 19th century who were trying to make sense of all these Egyptian records. So this wasn't some single group that called themselves the Sea Peoples. It's more like a label we've given to a whole collection of different groups mentioned in the texts. And this is how we even know what they looked like. The Egyptians, who were just meticulous record keepers, carved the faces and gear of their enemies right into their temple walls. Think of it as our ancient rogues gallery, complete with names and distinct features. You've got horned helmets, feathered headdresses, different types of shields. Each one tells a little piece of the story. So let's dive into that primary eyewitness testimony. We're lucky enough to have accounts from 3 of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. As you can see, this story unfolds over nearly 100 years. First, you've got Ramesses the Great fighting off pirates called the Sherden. Decades later, his successor, Merneptah, has to deal with a much bigger coalition. And then finally, Ramesses III confronts what looks like an all-out invasion. So this wasn't a single event. It was a crisis that just kept growing and growing. Now, what's really interesting here is how the lineup of suspects actually changes over time. Ramesses II mentions the Sherden and the Luca, but by the time we get to Ramesses III, we see all these new names popping up, like the Peleset and the Tejeker. This suggests we're dealing with a complex, shifting confederation, not just a single unified army. So, can we actually put a face to any of these names? Let's try to unmask some of the key players in this historical drama. First up, the Peleset. And you gotta look at that distinctive feathered headdress. These warriors are probably the most famous of all the groups mentioned by Ramesses III. And the evidence for who these people were is pretty compelling. Most scholars today agree that the Peleset are the very same people who later appear in the Bible as the Philistines. After their big fight with Egypt, they settled on the coast of what is now Israel and Palestine. And you know what? Archaeology totally backs this up. We find pottery and buildings in their cities that look like they came straight from the Aegean, from the Greek world. Next in the lineup are the Sherdens, and their story has one of the most fascinating twists in this entire case. They actually went from being feared raiders to elite bodyguards. So the Sherden start out as pirates, constantly attacking Egypt's coastline. But Ramesses II, after he defeats them, does something brilliant. He hires them. These former enemies literally become his elite personal bodyguards. And their name, Sherden, sounds so similar to Sardinia that many historians are convinced that this is either where they came from or where they eventually settled. But here's the clue that changes our entire perspective on this. The Egyptian carvings don't just show warriors, they show entire families on the move. Women, children, all of their belongings packed into these big ox carts. This was not just a raiding party. This was a migration. These people weren't just looking for stuff to steal, they were looking for a new home. So, with all the evidence on the table, what's the final verdict from modern historians on this ancient cold case? For a long time, the verdict was pretty simple.
A massive pirate fleet deliberately brought down civilization. But the modern view, supported by all this evidence, is so much more nuanced. The Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the collapse, they were a symptom of it. They were a mix of refugees, migrants, and yes, raiders, all set in motion by a much, much larger crisis. So the crucial takeaway is this. The Sea Peoples were not some single mysterious army. They were the human consequence of a world in total crisis, a perfect storm of climate change, drought, and famine that led to a complete political breakdown. It forced thousands of people from their homes, and they became raiders and invaders because their own world was already falling apart. We may never know the full story of the Sea Peoples, but their ghostly journey across a collapsing world serves as this incredibly powerful reminder, forcing us to ask a timeless and maybe uncomfortable question: just how fragile is the world that we've built for ourselves?